presentation, and then we will have a series of questions and answers. Okay? Go ahead, Julia. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. And now I need to get my meeting controls back. Okay. Hola. Thanks for having me remotely be with you. I'm really sad I cannot be there in person. It would be much nicer, but I'm not taking planes for work anymore. So this is one way that we can still have an exchange. And I'm going to tell you a bit about some recent research and some future research, and I really look forward to a discussion. I should also say that it's really nice to be giving a talk in Latin America. I think it's the first time for me, especially because in my field of ecological economics, there are so many really important thinkers from Latin America, and you will see some of their thinking in the presentation as well. So it's quite special for me from that perspective. So I'm going to talk about this project, Living Well Within Limits. So living well within planetary limits. Is it possible, and what will it take? And so let's get started. And I think that it's good to start with basics. So I want to start with some stylized facts, just some basic facts on energy and well-being. So how do we think about energy use and well-being together? So the first of these stylized facts is what I call the high plateau. And it's a very generic plot. And it doesn't really matter what you put on the axes. You can put any kind of energy use per person, per capita, on the horizontal axis, and you can put pretty much any well-being indicator on the vertical axis, and you will have a plot that looks like this. It looks, I think sometimes you can see my arrow. At low energy use values, you have a very steep slope. You have a very strong increase where every little piece of extra energy consumption corresponds to a high increase in well-being indicator. But at a certain point of energy use, that goes away. And what you see is you no longer see any real effect. You just see this very high flat plateau, and where more energy use does not cause you to have more well-being. And so here this is with annual electricity per capita in kilowatt hours versus the Human Development Index, but this is pretty much for any form of energy use and for any form of well-being. You'll see this sort of very steep and then saturation curve. The next stylized fact is what I call dynamic decline. So this is maybe slightly harder to understand, but the point here is that the energy threshold associated with any given level of well-being decreases dramatically over time. So if I go back to the previous plot where you have Human Development Index versus electricity, the point is that this is, if you made a curve out of it, it would not be a development curve. Countries do not move along this curve. Countries have their own trajectory, and it's the curve itself that is moving, going constantly higher and higher and higher. And that means that the level of energy use to achieve a high human development is something that we can measure to be dropping over time extremely fast. So this is a study I did in around 2010. So it's already a bit old, but the trend is very steady. That shows now energy on the vertical axis per capita in primary energy in gigajoules per capita versus time. And you see that this energy is dropping. The energy, for instance, for high human development is dropping over time. And what that means is that we've changed our resource use configuration. In the 1970s, we still had a resource constraint. We would have needed more energy total for everybody to have high human development than was being consumed total on the planet. And sometime in the 1990s, that situation changed, and we now use more energy total than we need for high human development worldwide. And so that's a very important shift that I think that decision makers haven't really realized is happening yet. And one of the things that's interesting with this dynamic decline is that it's so stable, you can use it as a basis for scenario. And these are two papers that have in fact used this, this trend of human development or well-being versus energy sort of dropping over time as a basis for scenario development. The third stylized fact of energy and well-being is that there's multidimensional diversity. So again, we're changing, you see the same shape here of the sort of steep ascent and then a flat plateau. But the dimensions are changing, but the shape stays the same. So the indicator here for well-being is now life expectancy in years on the vertical axis, and the indicator for energy is carbon emissions, which is an indicator of fossil fuel use. So coal, gas, and oil are all fossil fuels, and they would contribute to your carbon emissions in tons per capita. And what you can see here is that there are a whole bunch of countries that have relatively high life expectancy. So this is data that's, again, already a bit old, but the values are reasonably high. And you see this diversity of countries being represented in this corner of low carbon emissions and relatively high life expectancy. So, some of the countries in that corner have higher life expectancy than the US, for instance. And what you can see is that those countries represent they have like all these different colors because they represent really different characteristics in terms of geography, in terms of climate, in terms of income, in terms of different types of economies. And so lots of different countries can achieve this sort of higher well-being and low resource use. However, the ones that don't achieve it are the core wealthy consumers, which are the yellow countries. So the core wealthy consumers are basically too rich to have representation within this corner of high well-being and low resource use. So what if we want to go beyond stylized facts? What if we want to learn more about the world than we learn just from looking at these kinds of indicators? Then we kind of need a new research framework, a new analytic framework. And this is something we developed within the Living Well Within Limits project, which was a project I led in the United Kingdom over the last few years. And what this analytic framework looks like, and it's, it might look pretty simple, but it took us a while to think about it and to be happy with it. And we really used it for our research, as you'll see. Maybe what I'll do is I'll start with the left-hand side. So you have biophysical inputs. And so basically what this is telling us is that the way that we intervene in planetary processes and planetary limits is through our use of natural resources, whether it's energy, materials, land, harvests, water, etc. And so that tells us about this interaction between resource use and disrupting planetary processes. If you look on the right-hand side, what you see is social outcomes, where we basically say there are need satisfiers, and there's a certain number of them. There's not a huge number of them. There's not an infinite number of them. And that when people's needs are satisfied, that probably means that they have a decent level of well-being. And so here we have well-being as physical and mental health, autonomy, cognitive understanding, social participation, life satisfaction, and so on. And so that's how we understand social outcomes as needs and needs being satisfied and well-being. And then in the middle, maybe that's the most interesting part of this framework, is we have this object called provisioning systems. And provisioning systems are very interesting because they are an object of heterodox economics, not of mainstream economics. So this is already one of the places where we're stepping away from mainstream economics. And provisioning systems are very interesting because they're both physical and social. And the fact that they have social and physical attributes that interact with each other makes them quite interesting to study. And what we're saying is provisioning systems sit in the middle. They're basically what our economy is doing, using resources through provisioning systems to either satisfy needs or not. And that's what we're going to be looking at in this kind of research. So one of the first things that we wanted to do, and this was an idea of Dan O'Neill, so one of my colleagues in Leeds, was we wanted to test Kate Raworth's donut. So I don't know if you've read Donut Economics. I am sure it has been translated into Spanish. So this is the English edition. And in it, Kate Raworth sets out a new way of thinking about economics and what economics and the economy should be doing for us. And so on the outside of the donut, it's bad. So basically anywhere that's not inside the donut is bad. On the outside of the donut, you're transgressing planetary limits and you're entering into the danger zone, as we know, for the planet, for the stability of planetary systems. And on the inside of the donut, you're falling short in terms of social indicators, in terms of social performance and well-being. So what you want to do is you want to achieve the social foundation, which is the inner green circle, while staying within the environmental ceiling, which is the outer green circle. And we wanted to test whether or not countries are doing this. And so we did this. Here are some examples of countries for which we had data, and Mexico is in there too. But these are sort of two extremes. One is France and the other one is Sri Lanka. And you can see that France has a lot of red around it. France is transgressing most of the planetary limits, or the biophysical limits that we could measure. But you can see that there's not very much red on the inside. So France is doing pretty well on the social foundations. On the contrary, Sri Lanka is another extreme where it's not transgressing any planetary boundaries. But at the same time, you see that there's a lot of red on the inside. So that means that Sri Lanka is not doing well on the social foundations. So there's a lot of social deprivation in Sri Lanka. And you can see, you can find the website is called goodlife.leeds.ac.uk, and you can download all the papers, all the data, and play with it. It's quite fun. Okay, so when we wanted to look at all the countries together, and so what we did is basically we plotted them all on this graph, where you have every time a country transgresses a new planetary limit, we bump it up by one chunk on the horizontal axis, 1 unit on the horizontal axis. And every time it achieves one social outcome, we bump it up by 1 unit on the vertical axis. And so if you look at our two previous countries, you have France up here. And what is France doing? It's pretty horrible on the biophysical boundaries, but it's pretty good on the social thresholds. So that it's up in that upper right-hand corner. And where you see Sri Lanka, is doing quite well on the biophysical boundaries, not transgressing any, but not really well on the social thresholds. And then you can see that both France and Sri Lanka have neighbors, have other countries around them, so that they're not completely, they're not exceptions. And you can see that some countries are even in the sort of lower right-hand corner, where they have the worst of both worlds. They're doing terrible in biophysical boundaries, and they're doing really not great in social performance. And the problem with this plot is that there's one really empty area, which is where we need to be. We want to be having high social performance, and we want to not be destroying planetary stability. So this is a huge problem. This plot really represents our multi-crisis or polycrisis, because what it's saying is that we all, when Kate Raworth saw this plot, she was depressed like everybody else, but she said, we are all developing countries. We all have a long way to go to be where we need to be in order to live well and not destroy the planetary stability we all depend on. So the new research question becomes, how can we go from where we are now to there where we need to be in order to be okay without destroying the planet? So that's sort of the next research frontier. And one of the things that became very clear to us is we needed to look at inequality a lot more closely, because inequality plays a huge role. The previous plot showed national averages, and national averages hide a lot of crimes, and inequality generally, it tells us a lot, including inequality within countries. So this is just another a result that was put out by the UNEP emissions gap report from 2020, and there's sort of more updated results that show exactly the same pattern, but this visualization is quite nice. That show the globe is now divided into percentiles. It's divided by income. So the richest people, no matter where they live, and the poorest people, no matter where they live. And what you see is that the top 1% of income earners, which is red, have this huge carbon footprint, right, of something like almost 80 tons per capita. The top 10%, which is the purple, which includes the red, have this really high carbon footprint, which is probably, close to where some of the highest country averages are, of more than 20 tons per capita. And then you see the middle 40% is much lower, and the bottom 50%, so the bottom half of humanity, the poorest half of humanity, is way below 2 tons per capita. So there's this huge inequality of emissions, which correspond to fossil fuel use, divided by income. And this has macro consequences for the planet and for the climate. So if you look here at the pie, which corresponds to 35.5 gigatons of emissions in 2015, what you see is that the emissions of the top 1% correspond here to you can see it in red, to 15% of total emissions worldwide. The emissions of the top 10%, which is again red plus purple, is 48%. So the top 10% richest human beings are responsible for roughly half of our global emissions. And this is just a huge gobsmacking number. And it really shows us that we have a problem of income inequality, not just of population, for instance. And this becomes even clearer when you look at the emissions of the poorest half of humanity, which are only something like 7% of total emissions. So that's less than half of the emissions of the top 1%. So the poorest half of humanity emits less than half of what the richest 1% emits. And so you can see that inequality is a huge problem here. So we decided to look at this in a lot more detail. And this is a paper, this is sort of the main headline result from a paper that was published in 2020. It was the first paper of the PhD of Yannick Oswald. And so what we were doing here is we were mapping international and intranational, so across countries and within countries based on different income classes within countries, energy footprints. And so we're looking at what's happening between income groups, and we're also looking at what's happening across product categories. And so one of the things this allowed us to do, because all of a sudden you have a huge amount of data resolution, is it allowed us to look to do this mapping of products, where on this quadrant, you see on the top half of the quadrant, product categories that are consumed on average more by rich households. And on the bottom half, products that are consumed disproportionately by poor households. Now, rich households consume more of everything. So this is a question of proportionality. It's like, what percentage within a budget are these products taking up? And then on the left-hand side, you have low energy intensity. These are the products that have less environmental impact through energy consumption per dollar spent in the economy. And on the right-hand side, you have the high impact, the high energy intensity products that have a lot of environmental impact per dollar spent. And we were really interested in this luxury and high intensity corner. We just put the data down and tried to see what was there. And what we saw was really interesting is that every category in this luxury and high intensity quadrant is a transport category, and every single transport category is represented in this quadrant. So what this means is that rich households all around the world overconsume cars, so bigger cars, traveling for longer distances in their cars, flying more, taking more basically of all kinds of transportation. And so this is a problem that you do not grow your way out of. You really have to do something differently, because the more you grow, the more you have rich people, the more they're going to overuse transportation, and transportation is very hard to decarbonize. In contrast, on the lower right-hand side, we see heat and electricity, which really is the highest intensity category, and it's disproportionately consumed by poorer households. And that has to do with housing. So we have poorer households disproportionately using energy for housing, for heating, for cooling, for cooking food. And obviously they don't want to be spending the money on that. They don't want to be using this energy. They're not doing anything they really love with it, except living in comfortable circumstances, and thermally, having a house that's cool enough or warm enough to live in without being sick. So that's, again, a problem where those households will not afford the energy efficiency or retrofit or decarbonized energy necessarily, because they are the poorest households spending a disproportionate share of their budget already on it. So in terms of policies, what we proposed is we said, listen, here, this luxury and high intensity, you have to tax and regulate. You have to really sort of do that kind of measure on it. Whereas in the lower quadrant, you need public investment. You need it to invest publicly in efficiency and low carbon generation. And so that the understanding these inequalities and how products are used better allows us to think about policies in a more differentiated way. This is just to show that car transport increasingly drives climate breakdown. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. It's just to say that these additional emissions that are coming in the last decades, a lot of them are coming from just cars that are heavier than they need to be, as opposed to all other cars, whose emissions are actually declining. And this is a global problem of transport becoming worse and worse and worse. And there's various reasons for that. This is another result on inequality, which is a very recent result from January of this year. It's the last paper of Marta Baltrushevit's PhD, and she looked at energy footprints in the UK. And what you can see is, so here you have the richest 10% of the UK at the top, the lowest 10% of the poorest 10% of the UK at the bottom. And what you can see is that the household energy footprints for housing are remarkably equal across income groups. And this is honestly kind of crazy. It has to do with specifics of the UK. It's normally you would see some difference, not a huge difference, but you would see some difference. But where you see inequality really taking off, pun intended, is with flights and car energy use. So you really see housing being relatively equal, and then transportation is where this huge amount of inequality shows up. And the inequality in transportation is so high that the richest 10% in the UK use more energy on flights than the poorest 20% use total. So you see this really hugely unequal situation in the UK, but this is probably true in many countries as well, and probably in Mexico as well. So we have this problem with transportation. We have a problem of inequality and different purposes of energy being used. So one of the things we were also interested in trying to understand was what socioeconomic or political factors allow some societies from achieving well-being at low energy use or not. So if you look at a society, how much well-being or need satisfaction they have, and what level of energy use they have, what are the factors that enable us to understand what's going on there? And this is a study where basically what we're doing is we're looking at energy use on the one hand, we're looking at need satisfiers, the satisfaction of human needs on the other hand, and that would give us, if we were just looking at those two aspects, it would just give us a kind of quantitative model where we're looking at need satisfaction as a function of energy use. That's just a two-variable model. But now what we want to do is we want to look at these socioeconomic or political aspects, which take us more towards provisioning systems. And that gives us another kind of variable, which is a third variable of provisioning systems. And then we also look at an interaction term between energy and provisioning systems, which enables us to understand the whole thing quite well. And I'm not going to go into detail of the study. I'll just tell you what we found because it was very, very striking. We found some positive factors and we found some negative factors. So the positive factors mean a higher value of a positive factor allows societies to achieve higher well-being at low energy use. And the positive factors were public services. And if there's anything that you can remember from this evening, it's that public services protect populations against low resource use. If you have high quality, affordable public services, people are okay, even in societies where there's generally a lot of deprivation. So public services are massively important, including healthcare, including, all kinds of things, public transportation, etc. Income equality is very positive. So the more equal your society is, the better you'll be able to do. Democracy turns out to be quite important, which is nice, I think. electricity and sanitation access, as well as networked infrastructure access in general, are very important. So households that have good transportation links or electricity network links do better. We also identified some negative factors in our data. And these, so extractivism is a highly negative factor. Extractivism is terrible. And if you know ecological economics or even mainstream economics, this is a well-known problem. It's called the resource curse. It's called Dutch disease. It's called Baumol syndrome, I think. So what it means is that economies that depend on mining, fossil fuel extraction for, a large proportion of their GDP have very bad social performance. And so this is something that we see in our data as well. The other thing that we saw as negative is economic growth above a moderate income. So above a moderate average income, when societies are growth seeking, they have a hard time satisfying needs at low energy use. And so that's another thing that came out of the data that we were rather surprised to see, but there it was. It was quite a significant effect. Another thing that I'm sort of going through our results. I hope some of them will be interesting to you. So far, I've been showing you observation analysis of what we did. We also did some modeling. We also decided to look, okay, how can we imagine a different future? What could a different future look like? So this maybe, is a nice looking future, perhaps. It's in Montreal, a place without cars where people are just sort of walking around, sitting, enjoying themselves. So what could we imagine as a possibly different future? So here what we're doing is we're taking the Decent Living Energy Framework of Professor Narasimha Rao of Yale University, and he developed this decent living energy to basically connect human needs to sufficient levels of energy services. So his idea here is that at a certain level of energy use services, people's needs are satisfied, and they are not suffering material deprivation. They are living in comfort. They can have life plans. They can, do whatever they want and not be harmed by lack of material comfort or safety. So what we did is made a global model based on this decent living energy framework. It takes into account technology improvements. So we basically took efficient technologies and thought about everybody having access to them. Everybody has the same access to energy services and the same access to technology. So everybody has the same efficiency, and it results in lower demand levels. So what the model looks like and takes into account is you basically have decent living standards. Some of them are taken into account, and obviously some we weren't able to model, like, freedom to gather, freedom to dissent, air quality. We also didn't model leisure or culture. Well, leisure to some extent, but not culture. But we did model, nutrition, living conditions, clothing, you have washer and dryer, you have mobility, you have communication and information. So everybody has access to a phone. Every household has a computer with internet, with Wi-Fi, with data. So this is not a low-tech future, right? Everybody has access to modern conveniences, or as we call them in the UK. So everybody has access to just sort of very convenient technologies. Everybody has access to thermal comfort, to hot water, to illumination, and so on. Then we model both direct energy and embodied energy, so gray energy. We also have public consumption, so hot schools and hospitals. We also have private consumptions, offices and retail space. And we also have infrastructure for building the houses and transportation networks and schools and hospitals and networked infrastructures and so on. So we have put all of this in the model. And in terms of the energy services, what they look like, so, you have sufficient nutrition based on demography. You have living space heated or cooled to 20 degrees year round, roughly 15 meters square per person. It's not huge, but it's heated or cooled to 15 degrees year round. If you have more space that's not heated or cooled, you could add that in, presumably, and which is dependent on climate. You have clean water, heated water, communication, mobility. So mobility is 5,000 to 15,000 kilometers per year, depending on rural or urban settings, health and education. And then also the energy embodied in appliances and infrastructure and so on. And what does that tell us as a result? So let's just focus on the left-hand side. What that shows is global final energy use, and you see it's in units of hundreds of exajoules EJ, which is a very large number. It has lots of zeros in it. And this shows the current, our current final energy use, or historical final energy use in black, with the IEA International Energy Agency reference scenarios and sort of two sort of ambitious climate scenarios where they sort of stabilize energy use. There was a previous low energy demand paper by Arnold Grubler and colleagues, which is the blue arrow, which arrived at roughly 250 exajoules in 2050. And our model, the decent living energy model, arrived at about 150 exajoules in 2050. So compared to the IEA reference scenario, we're almost a factor of 4 below it. And the IEA reference scenario does not take everybody out of poverty, which our model actually does. So in theory, based on existing technologies, existing efficient technologies, decent living energy for all would be achievable at 40% of our current energy use, despite population growth until 2050. So that's quite a striking result. Jarmo Kikstra and his colleagues looked at how much you would basically a similar kind of study using decent living energy framework. And they tried to think about what is necessary for investment. And the investment in infrastructure is massive. And so here they're looking at the level of energy. Again, this is this unit of exajoules, this very large energy unit. The investment in infrastructure would be massive, especially in the domains of shelter, so housing and mobility. So we're talking about a massive investment, 290 exajoules, but that could be done over several years. And it's less than a year of our current energy use. So this is not a crazy thing to invest in. But you can see that it's really quite huge. What's really interesting is if you look at the annual energy use after investment, and they come to a result that's very close to ours, around 150 or 160 exajoules per year. For instance, you can see that shelter is tiny. So that's one of the things, if we take a sustainability turn, we would be investing massively in efficient housing for everybody so that everybody could have heated or cooled, safe housing to live in. And that would not take much energy use to operate after we do that investment. So that's one of our current moments of conundrum is investment versus use. And you can see that despite the fact that there's a huge investment in mobility, in the future, mobility still takes a lot of energy. It would take roughly half of it accounts for half of the decent living energy, just because to move things around, you need energy. So physics does not let you off the hook. So this means that a good life for all within planetary limits may be technically possible. In that case, what is standing in our way? So there's some examples from what we did in terms of political economy, of car dependency, and privatization of essential services. And I think this is really important to understand. So I'll try to go through it, even though it's sort of taking a turn into qualitative social science. So here what we're doing is we're looking at these systems of provision. And one of the things that we're doing that we understand, for instance, from Giulio Mattioli's work in his 2020 paper on a political economy of car dependency, is that we understand that provisioning systems could enable good lives at low resource use, but are often engineered and have been engineered over many decades to create resource dependency. So car dependency was really an industrial creation. Car dependency was not due to consumer demand. It was really forced upon people in various ways. Dependency on resource-intensive consumption is thus itself an industrial product driven by decades of lobbies, subsidies, lobbying, subsidies, and state and regulatory capture. So the automotive industry and the road industry have been working for decades to create this situation of car dependency, and we're now finding it very hard to get away from it. And there are very good examples of this all around the world, and I'm sure you have good examples or bad examples in Mexico as well. So when we studied this, we looked at many 5 different dimensions of the creation of car dependency. We looked at the car industry, we looked at roads and parking, we looked at land use for cars, so land use planning. We looked at the neglect for public transportation, which is an active neglect, and we looked at the creation of car culture. And all of these things really come together to create car dependency in our economies. And one of the reasons this happens, and actually, I think I'm not going to go into this because most of you are not economists, and this will not make sense to you. So I'm just going to skip these 2 slides. But basically, just to say that we have a false understanding of the economy as demand-driven when it is really supply-driven, with different industries holding together, as shown in this image, to really sort of impose the same kind of resource-intensive lifestyles onto everybody. And so the market is much less of a free market and much more of a sort of funnel for those industries to make sure that they can always rely on consumption. One of the things we also looked at, and I'm sure that this is also happening in Mexico, is looking at the privatization of public services. So we looked at the privatization of water, electricity, and buses in the United Kingdom. And we saw that there was sort of, we looked at different actors, which is what you're supposed to do in a system of provision analysis. So we looked at the providers and their financial investors. We looked at the state and the regulatory agency, and we looked at consumers. And we saw that the privatization was justified by certain narratives around deregulation, around efficiency, around people would be able to satisfy their needs more efficiently through the market. And then we uncovered the reality, which is sort of the purple level, sort of the lowest level, which is we found that the providers were doing rent extraction. They were not using the revenues to do any kind of investment. And the consumers, in fact, were seeing cost increases. And so partly our research was formed part of the basis of Philip Alston, who was this UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. He visited the United Kingdom in 2019, and partly on the basis of our research, one of the things he concluded was that abandoning people to the private market in relation to services that affect every dimension of their basic well-being without guaranteeing their access to minimum standards is incompatible with human rights requirements. And I think that this goes back to this really, really strong importance of available, efficient, affordable public services for everybody of really high quality. This is really one of the things that we need to be pushing for in terms of, allowing our societies to be sustainable. So in the future, I am going to this is our new research grant on post-growth economics. So it's called Real, a Post-Growth Deal. My colleagues are Yorgos Callas, Jason Hickel in Barcelona, in Spain. So one of them at least could have probably given this talk in Spanish, so that would have been better. We have these 5 different work packages looking at the 5 Ps of post-growth, looking at north-south, so planetary possibilities. We're looking at north-south convergence scenarios, the material prerequisites for decent living, and we want to look at post-growth integrated assessment scenarios. We want to look at post-growth policies, both for the EU and for global South countries. We want to look at post-growth provisioning, meaning looking at democratic provision alternatives. So looking at this idea of economic democracy and what that means, and modeling transformed provision. And we want to look at politics and bring ideas also into practice. And that's what we will be doing for the next few years, sort of taking this research forward into the next stages. We're really going to be moving forward on the models, charting different aspects of post-growth pathways, the policy deals I already mentioned, but this is really important, trying to look at coherent policy packages that, for instance, political parties could take up or popular movements could take up. And that's one of the things that we really want to do, is engage with political movements, social movements, and decision makers. I always end my talks with this slide. I am a scientist who is now also an activist. And I was really highly influenced by the article in Nature, Ecology, and Evolution, Scientists Must Act on Our Own Warnings to Humanity. So basically, the scientists who alerted the world to the climate and ecological crisis have a moral duty to join popular movements demanding political action. We've written a couple of, for me, this includes civil disobedience. And we've also written a couple of papers, like one targeted at universities, From Publications to Public Actions, the Role of Universities in Facilitating Academic Advocacy and Activism, and also trying to support environmental protesters who are being criminalized around the world, whether it's in the United Kingdom or in Switzerland or around Europe or in the United States, or also in Latin America, Africa, Asia, everywhere around the world. We're seeing this push of criminalization of climate protesters and environmental defenders. And it really is a way of industry continuing to control our governments, is what we're seeing more and more. It's very anti-democratic. And so that's one of the things that I think we should also be working on a lot more. And we also published this one more recently. I think this was in Nature, basically saying that civil disobedience by scientists helps press for urgent climate action. And I will leave it there, and I look forward to any discussion, hopefully. I hope that was not too long or too confusing. And I am a black shadow. How spooky. I did not know. I couldn't see myself.
No, thank you.
Well, let me see if I can. It's dark here right now, so let me see if I can change my
I don't know if you see the audience. We're really excited about your presentation. Yes, I think. But well,
so let me just see if I can.
We have many questions already, so I will give first.
That's even worse.
Luca Ferrari to give a short comment, and then.
You don't mind, I stay seated because I put a lot of notes. Thank you very much, because you give a very good synthesis of all your works in the past 15 years. I think you touched a lot of very, very important points. I would like to give a brief comment, synthesis of your talk, which is not so easy, but I think that there are 4 main points that we want to line. The first part of the conference is the connection between resource, energy, and economy. So you show us that basically there is an almost linear correlation between energy consumption, emission, ecological destruction, overshoot, and economic growth. So this is evident empirically in many studies, but we also see that the countries that have a more satisfying society, where the society satisfies the basic needs, are also those that consume more. And basically, no countries is presently in the safe and just space. You put the example of France versus Sri Lanka, which are two extremes of this. So this is the big problem, I think, because we keep thinking that to get a better life, especially in the global south, we need to grow, we need to consume more. And definitely, some part of the population need to do so, but another part need to reduce their consumption. I think that the other very important point is the role of inequality in consumption and emission. This is something that has been pointed out in the past 8 years at least, and is very, very important because we see that we are not all responsible in the same way of the contamination, of the pollution, of the emission. But also, I think, inequality is not only an ethical or political issue, but also a technical, scientific problem. If we want to go towards a sustainable world, it would take much more efforts and actually energy consumption and material consumption if we maintain this unequal world. So here the problem is which kind of policies we can do, we can propose to reduce this brutal inequality, especially in countries like Mexico, for example, where we know that the topmost decide, the 10% richest people in Mexico consume in the middle 7 times what consumed related to the bottom of 50%. So this is very important, but also it's a very difficult task from the political point of view, because people that stay in the lower part aspire to get at the level of the rich. So we can put a limit to the very rich people, but also we can change the mentality, the mindset of the people that would like to be like them. And a third point that I wanted to underline is this part. This is related with the previous one. The mediating factors between use of resources and social benefits. I appreciated the paper that you show us when you see that there are some positive mediating factors, and these are the public services, income equality, democracy. This is very, very important. Everybody, I think that intuitively feel that these are very important, but you have a very solid technical, scientific support to this. And also, among the negative factors is the extractivism and the economic growth above the rating. Extractivism is very serious, especially in the global south, and especially in Mexico. We had several books yesterday about extractivism, the extractivism of mineral resources, particularly. And I think that here this is very critical point, because we are told that the transition, the energy transition, toward the solution to the climate change is renewable energy, but renewable energy, particularly solar and wind power, needs a lot of infrastructure that needs a lot of minerals. And so this will accelerate the extraction of minerals, particularly in South America and Mexico and other part of the global south. Then there is the last part that I think that this is the hope that the different model is possible. You show also that a low energy society that satisfies the basic need is possible. We can live within this living standard. This is living standard. We can live with sufficient well-being just with the 40% of the energy use. And this is a great news, because actually we can reduce energy and material consumption, and at the same time we can reduce emission and also our environmental impact. So this is very important. But this is technically possible. You see, this is a scientific model. But what about the politics and how we can reach this growth? How we can go to the safe and just space? So how a great part of the world population can increase their consumption to the minimum for a decent life, and how to reduce the overconsumption of the commodities. This is a political problem, and also I think it is a very difficult task, because capitalism, we live in capitalism. Capitalism is based on the growing, perpetual growth, consumerism, and so this is it's really hard to come with a solution without questioning the economic system in which we live. And also, there is a psychological dimension, because we are accustomed to think that more consumption gives us more satisfaction and well-being. So, well, I think that all these points that you brilliantly exposed are very, very interesting. And I also wanted to comment about your decision to give the talk by Zoom. We all would like to have you here discuss, but I think that your decision is very consequential, very coherent with what you are fighting for. You decided not to come because you don't want to consume and emit all these greenhouse gases related to the international life, because we saw, and you thought also, that the main consumption, overconsumption of the rich on transport, and particularly on the national flights, and also cars, of course. So, yeah, I think that these are some of the main points that I could catch from your talk. And, well, I don't know if I can start with a question just to break the ice. And my main question would be conciliate your conclusion about the growth with, for example, the recommendation of the IPCC or the European Union policy, because I don't see that there is I think there is a difference, profound difference. I know that also last year several scientists go to the European Union to talk about the growth, but for what I understand, there was almost no consequence. You're still thinking in Europe that green growth is possible, whereas you and your colleagues, like this article, George show that this is not possible, this is not happening. There is no decoupling between economic growth and emission, for example. So this is a difficult question, but and I think that your work, your specific work, is excellent, but I feel that the results are not impacting on the policy, at least in Europe and the global north.
Wow. So I am extremely impressed by your summary. So I think I do not need to give these talks anymore. That was extremely impressive. I now have more clarity on my own research thanks to your summary. So to go to your question, I think that it's really important to have ideas of alternatives in place. So for various reasons. One is that we've sort of been living in a desert of economic imagination, which is a very dangerous place to live, because at a moment of crisis, it's really good to have different alternatives around. And I really wish that we had more sort of off-the-shelf policy proposals, models to see how they impact our economies, so that we could say, oh, well, we could do A, B, or C, rather than just let's just keep growing and putting everything into growth and inequality and hope somehow things turn out different than they have for the past few decades, because that is truly insane, right? So I think that it's important to have these alternatives ready, because we don't know how fast things can tip. And as marginal as degrowth and post-growth are now, they used to be far more marginal. So we are really surprised by the amount of attention there is from policymakers, often not very public. So I'm asked by many political parties in Switzerland, come talk to us about degrowth. We think it's important, but we don't know how to talk to the voters about it yet. So a lot of things are happening maybe below the surface, but people are really starting to think about this. And maybe the people talk about social tipping points as well as planetary tipping points. So at some point, there might be a change in people's desire to try something really different. And we might be surprised at how the work we are doing to prepare now might turn out to be quite important. I think that that's one aspect. In terms of political programs, it's not, I don't think it's completely true that nothing is being done, because I think that European countries, unlike North America, unlike the US and Canada, I should say, I should not forget that Mexico is also North America. Unlike the US and Canada or Australia, say, Europe is adopting policies to reduce energy demand. That is an explicit goal. It's not necessarily to reduce GDP, but we're looking at policies to reduce resource use explicitly. And some of those don't fall under the label of degrowth. Some of those fall under the label of sufficiency, or sobriété in French, sobriety. So the idea is that at some point enough is enough, and overconsumption should be discouraged, and also minimum consumption level should be achieved. And so this idea of sufficiency is actually something that is starting to exist in policies in Europe around housing, not yet really around transportation, but some of the policies are gaining some level of support. Say, for instance, a frequent flyer tax. So not a tax on all carbon or on all flying, but say if you fly more than twice a year, it's going to start costing you a lot of money. So those kinds of things. So this idea of sufficiency-oriented policies, I think, are gaining quite a bit of ground.
Thanks, Julia. So we will open the floor for questions. Si alguien quiere hacerla en español, no hay problema, se la traducimos a Julia. Así que, okay. We have one question, Patty, please.
Yeah, so hi Julia, this is Patty Barbanera from Viena, colleague of the same Instituto as well. Thanks so much for the talk. It's really interesting. I totally see how your models are in a way addressing these top consumers in terms of the countries that consume more, and the logic is kind of really tapping there. But living in Mexico and visiting many countries in the global south, I wonder how much these ideas really apply to other countries. So, for instance, I think in countries like Mexico, India, or even China, I'm sure there's a top 1% of very rich people who really contribute very, very high consumption rates. But on the other hand, what we show both in the first part of the talk and in your models, that the major issues about the public infrastructure, the public services for people of lower income to be able to reduce their energy use and still have a certain level of being inside the dollar, you say. So what you left me thinking is, what does it take for, I would say, 150 or even 200 countries that would need to have, according to this approach, a much stronger investment in these public services, but they wouldn't have the financial conditions, or do they have, or are they incorporated in the board? But also the technical capacities and, of course, the governance issues in terms of the huge power inequities and so on. So for me, I totally understand these models are excellent to inform the European Commission and so on. But I still wonder what would be the strategy for so many countries, maybe 2/3 or more of the countries, that would need a different approach.
So thanks for that question. It's a really important one. And I think that that's something that we really want to make a really big focus of this new project, the REAL project, which because it's a European project, but because it's ERC funding, we are free to do whatever we want. And what we want to do is we want to focus on non-European countries and the whole sort of international trade architecture, including the role of debt, the role of structural adjustment programs and the IMF and World Bank, which are still playing a huge role in constraining investment in public services and investment in every other thing, actually. So we really want to be thinking about what those countries can do and what those countries could do in different circumstances as well. So what pieces of these constraints, such as debt, and these structural adjustment programs and other constraints. I mean, the IMF and World Bank are insane. They're charging countries higher interest rates. They're charging African countries higher interest rates on solar panels than they are on coal-fired power plants. So it is cheaper in Africa because of these organizations to invest in coal-fired power plants. Africa does not have coal, but they have tons of sun. And I mean, so the real economics are completely distorted and compared to what these international organizations are doing. And so we want to basically be exploring this and sort of saying, okay, well, if we manage to take this piece away, this constraint away, what would be possible? In terms of intranational inequality, it's true that a lot of investment capacity is lacking in a lot of countries in, generic term, the global South. But partly that investment capacity is lacking because of the imposition of debt repayments and because of fiscal coercion from these international organizations. So to qualify to be in the good club, you can't invest, even though you might want to, and even though it would be a completely rational thing to do. So these are some of the things that that we want to be looking at a lot more in the real project. And I would say that the team, so the person who's going to be leading this work is Jason Hickel, and the team of quite young and amazing researchers that he's assembling to do this work they're already gaining some really interesting insights as to how one could move forward on this. But honestly, for anybody who's been involved in world systems theory or post-development, some of these things will not be mysteries, right? We're talking about dismantling a very unequal post-colonial trade architecture. But that's necessary for a sustainable future as well as for a just future. So here we are again.
Thanks, Julia. So we have another question. Diego, please.
Thank you very much. I'm not an economist, I'm a biologist. I learned about your talk today. It's very interesting. I did have a question, however, and that is in your different countries and the approach that you do for your models. I mean, just from looking at the graph, it would be quite straightforward that you should be more policymakers on what are the strategies that achieve lower levels of energy use and better development for people. However, we are living in a world in which we see all these migrations from developing countries into Europe or the US through Mexico. But it's not only people that go to Mexico, Mexican. So also there is a threshold through which countries are not being able to switch their policies to achieve these goals that you are proposing. So I was wondering if you could actually implement your models analysis of what are the minimum thresholds to be able to move to a stage or point with all these indicators. It may be that some countries don't have the capacity, or we are in those countries to, for example, access decent public transportation or access, good housing to be able to achieve better levels of level and to different positions in this sense. Thank you.
Okay, I'm really sorry. The sound was a bit garbled for some of the key points of your question. So could you try to repeat it? The person holding the microphone, or I'm really sorry. It's just some of it is a bit.
Yes.
No. It's just trying to speak slower and open my mouth here. And I hope that helps. Basically, I was asking the answer that you gave to that before kind of pertain to international scenarios and how they affect your models. I was trying to see it more from the countries themselves and inside in the countries, and how the fact that in this time you see so many crises given through international migration from Africa into Europe, from Latin American countries to Cuba through the US, and that of course indicates that there is no way to satisfy the needs of people who are migrating, and how that may be, how you could address this in your models by setting thresholds of welfare within each country that may not be, are not being achieved in order to be able to move to a different stage of welfare. Like these are not really continuous. They have, if you don't have certain situation, you are gonna not satisfy these needs, and people are having. I hope my question is clear.
Okay, so I understood that it was about basically the issue of migration and welfare provision.
Yeah.
Perfect. So I think that, well, people migrate for a whole bunch of reasons, but inadequate welfare provision is definitely a big one of them, because people want economic security and they want, better, more secure lives. And but I think that the fact that this inequality exists and persists is not, there's basically two big theories of development in economics. One is the sort of treadmill, or the escalator theory, which is that everybody is on an escalator and we're all going to get to the top of the stairs. And that's sort of the smooth development. And that basically we just need to go, countries need to go through some painful stages, such as like the Philippines, where a lot of people migrate or work in very harsh conditions in order to eventually reach the top of the escalator. And the other theory of development is called world systems theory, and it's much more Marxian. And it basically says, no, there's an inequality is built into it. And the countries that are in the middle stay in the middle, and the countries that are at the bottom stay in the bottom. And it's very hard to, and the countries that are at the top stay in the top and depend for being on the top for the dispossession and underdevelopment of other countries. So, for instance, the US and Europe keeping countries in the global south and Africa or Latin America or Asia from access to technology, or having punitive loan conditions, or not letting them invest in their own countries in education and so on. These are sort of post-colonial structures that are meant to keep those countries in relative deprivation so that labor is cheap and resources are cheap. And I think that world systems theory is probably a better explanation of how development fails to happen. And what it means is that if we want to achieve good welfare levels in different countries and allow people to stay at home for their welfare, that we need to think seriously about these conditions of these persistent conditions of international stratification in terms of who is deciding what for who, which is a really big issue. I hope that helped a bit.
Yes, thank you. Okay. Got any more questions? How much time do we have? 10 minutes. Okay.
Hi, Julia. Sorry. Well, I was thinking about in the Mexican context of the economy that we are so linked with the United States and Canada economy with the NAFTA. I would like to ask how we think in a different kind of economy, thinking in that context, in the NAFTA, thinking in that we are like in a developed country, but we are linked for the next, 20 years with one of the most, like the most powerful economies in the world, like the United States. Thank you.
By NAFTA, he refers to the North American.
I know what NAFTA is. I tried to stop it. I am sorry. I was part of the anti-NAFTA protest back in the day. Yes, so these unequal trade agreements are terrible. And this is one of the things we need to grapple with, is how much is possible within them, or how much is possible with, how much one needs to dismantle these kinds of architectures. And this is something that is happening, actually. For instance, within Europe or across Europe, and there's, for instance, it's not quite free trade treaty, but it's focused on energy. There's an energy charter treaty that the European Union is thinking about getting out of and exploding on the way out, because it favors fossil fuel dependence, and it does good things for fossil fuels industries and bad things for climate and public governments. So I think that one of the things that might happen is that, hopefully, is that these international structures get called into question. I think also that the United States comes from this ideology of dominance where people have really accepted the fact that the United States needs to dominate the rest of the world, including Mexico as the neighbor to the south, maybe first of all, in order to be okay, in order to live decent lives, in order to achieve good conditions for everybody. That's how these treaties and that's how this trade architecture is sold domestically in the US, right? That people are, the governments and these industries have managed to convince people that we need to be unequal for Americans to live well. And this is an ideology that goes back a very long time. And it's no longer true. It was probably kind of true in the 40s and 50s. It is no longer true. It would be possible for North Americans to live decent lives without having to exploit other people in other countries. But they don't know that yet, and it's not been tried yet. So I think that that's one of the things that we're trying to model as well. We're going to have models that look at embodied labor. So one of the things that NAFTA did was it allowed the US to get lots of cheap labor from Mexico, which is horrible. But we're going to look at embodied labor and sort of try to model, at least in a model, look at how labor dependencies and exploitation, presumably, would change in a more sufficiency or degrowth oriented scenario. And so at least we'd have a look at some of those questions. Solving it in reality, solving any of these problems in reality is a huge complicated issue, but at least we can try to make some progress on what things would look like in a different world and make it less scary, hopefully. But I am sorry about NAFTA. It's terrible.
Thanks, Julia. So yes, we have time for one more.
Thanks, Julia. Hi, Julia. Thank you very much. This is Viena from Viena. I'm also part of this project that holds and coordinated here in Mexico to address the complex question of energy and social and environmental justice. I have two questions, perhaps are more common. The first one has to do with this study that you made, where you're calculating. And you hear me? Okay. Yeah, this study that you are calculating how to adjust using the connectivity well-being. I don't know, like maybe using convenient technologies, modern technologies. And of course, it's super interesting, and I think it's attractive to policymakers that want to gather voters and so on. And we're talking about the European context. But I was thinking that, again, like thinking back my other reflections, what about the global south? Because maybe we don't necessarily need to keep importing this type of modern technologies, like efficient technologies, because it's kind of part of a co-efficiency model that shows inequality between the global north and the global south, because power relations and so on. And we have in Mexico, as well as Latin America, Africa, South Asia, and so on, other types of technologies to harvest energy, to organize productive systems, and so on. And Pharmaceutica has a lot of experience on eco-technologies and culturally adapted technologies. So I think this could be one of the interesting routes to think about these scenarios beyond the European Union or the global economy in general. And the second question has also to be with that perspective in global north, global south that you're going to explore more in this project. And it has to be with taking back public services against this wave of privatization and so on. And I think in Latin America we have a very important political debate around that, because as you might know, there have been a lot of political projects by progressive government that basically are proposing to take back the power of the state over certain infrastructures and natural resources and so on. But that doesn't happen being translated in overcoming extractive economy. So in the case of Latin America, another context in the global south, I think the discussion about recovering public services and the power of the public organization of the economy has to come with also thinking about an alternative geopolitics and an alternative relation to the global. Because if the global north keeps demanding these resources and keeps pushing it with them, we're not, I mean, we can redistribute rent, extract this rent, but we're not going to go to the port.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Those are two really important points. So I think the first one is around, you know, which technologies are the technologies we need, where would they be, where would the appliances or thing, you know, where would they be made? This is super interesting, and you know, when we did this model, we had to go quick and fast, and you know, just do it easy, right? I mean, it wasn't so easy to do, but we had to do very simple. And every time somebody questions it, it's like it becomes very interesting, because I had a postdoc who was from North Africa, and one of the things he was saying, well, we don't need houses made out of concrete because we have traditional building techniques that allow us to be cool and dry, and that could work quite well, but we need to be able to reclaim those techniques. Or some students who said, what about nomadic people? They don't have the same view of what's necessary for their well-being, and we have nomadic people within Europe. We have left, you know, they're still alive, some of them, despite multiple genocides and so on. And so there's different perceptions on what people want, and the technologies or the sort of more traditional approaches that people would use to want to do that. And I think that it would be really interesting to try to capture those and have dialogues, you know, sort of looking at existing examples, looking at what different communities, different geographies are interested in doing, and seeing how one would represent that and what that would look like. So I really don't think it's necessarily one size fit all. We did one size pretty much fits all just because we needed to do something to demonstrate that you could think about this. But then, of course, it's very interesting to have higher resolution and more granularity and understand things better. And also in terms of, you know, who is making what for whom, I think is a core question. You know, who are we reliant on for different technologies, for different resource use? So all of these questions come into play. And in terms of the second point, which around privatization and rent extraction from resources, and who is doing what in the global division of labor, right? I think that the question went a bit in that direction. I think that that's something that we have to be thinking about very carefully. The geopolitics of it. So we have a geopolitical angle in our new project, but I really think, I mean, first of all, we don't want to be doing all of this research. Other people should be doing this research too. So join us, take whatever part of it you want, do it. This is great. More and more people are joining that effort, and I think it's really important because we're too small a number. The second point is we are going to try to do something around the geopolitics of resource use, resource rents, unequal exchange, and so on. And we are also going to be thinking about alternative democratic forms of provision. So basically this idea of economic democracy, which is both in production and consumption, how do we take decision-making back into our own hands in terms of who is doing the work, under what conditions, what infrastructures are communities surrounded by or affected by, how do communities and consumers, households decide what they want to consume and how. So basically right now, we have democracies when they function-ish, stopping at the edge of the market. And the most important decisions in our democracies are made in the market for us. So we have to, so that's one of the things to think about is forms of organization that allow us to take decisions in the marketplace in terms of production and consumption and investment. And that's really, there are examples of these happening all over the world. There are examples of these happening in many different sectors, you know, from food to housing to transportation to energy production healthcare, you name it. But we have to think about this in a very generalized way and give policy proposals that will help people imagine that they can take decisions in an economy. Because right now people just think, oh, I'm a consumer and all I get to do is decide on prices. And that's not a reasonable thing for people to be limited by. So I think that's one thing to think about, is this idea of economic democracy, which gives rights to people at sites of extraction. You have more you should have more rights in that democracy if you're more affected, if you're a frontline community or more vulnerable community. So that would be sort of one direction to think of.
Thanks, Julia. And just a follow-up, I have no question, and I can the power, electric and political. Now, that's a follow-up, you know, and now coming to Jason Hickel, that is another author, is a researcher part of this team, Julia mentioned. I think he is very clear that there is no degrowth possible unless we change the capitalist system. And
yep.
So I think I would like you to comment on that, because it's not just it's a political stake, but it's also a stake about the need to really build different imaginaries. So it's,
yep.
And I agree with this. I'm posing this question because I think we cannot continue trying to fix, tuning the model that's really the logic. The inherent logic of the capitalist system is to grow and to get more, and also to get unequal circumstances to grow inequality. So I think well, my question is, what is your take on this need to really go and develop these different imaginaries? And I'm asking this question because I told you before the presentation that there's different groups of people here working with indigenous communities, with groups that they already have a different way of thinking that has been completely subsumed by the current system, but that now with this a possibility, to think about a new world, a new way of getting with people, each other, and with nature. So maybe we could learn a lot, but be clear about what are the limits of the current system, and what it takes, if it takes or not. We can do this, achieve these goals within this system, or we really need to think about a very different way of organizing the economy and institution, etc. So this is my question.
Thanks for that question. And I'm not sure if it was a question or a comment, but either way, I agree with everything you're saying. I think that degrowth and post-growth are anti-capitalist or post-capitalist programs. I do agree that it's important to have this imaginary because, we are in this moment of great poverty of imagination. So I think that we need lots of different alternatives to think about. And it's often very helpful to realize that human cultures have been very different over time and very stable over time and very creative over time. And so looking back to different indigenous practices or looking forward to different indigenous practices and forms of organization, I think is really, really important as well, because there is that diversity and that creativity, and we can see it happening and learn a lot from it. So I think that learning from these alternatives is super important, and really paying attention to them. And again, giving them more representation and more power in these in whatever new structures come up. I guess one of the things I would just say, maybe as a compliment, is that I agree that degrowth is an anti-capitalist program. I'm very strongly agreeing on that. However, when people hear anti-capitalist, like, oh, we need to destroy capitalism in order to have a chance in the future, they often get very depressed because they see it as this big unsurmountable thing. And I think one of the things that I'm really trying to bring forward is this idea that there are pragmatic steps we can take also within capitalism. And a lot of people call them, I think including Matthias Schmelzer and others, call them transformative reforms. So reforms that kind of shake the system up and that really help do more than reform it. So it's not a necessarily improvement. It's a transformative change. And I think, for instance, sufficiency policies are a transformative change. Economic democracy is a transformative change. So I think one of the things we need to do is come up with a political program or a set of political programs that help us do this thing of breaking down capitalism and transforming our economies. But that's not like, it's not, you know, where your to-do list isn't like first task, destroy capitalism, next task, prosper, because that sounds very, very hard to achieve as, you know, a day's work, but maybe these other things that can get done in a much more sort of practical way. And that's one of the things we need to change things right here, right now. So we need to be able to have these practical steps that other people can sort of engage with, because a lot of people, when you say, let's destroy capitalism, come on, let's go. A lot of them will say, yes, that sounds fine. But a lot of them will also say, I'm not really sure what comes next. And if you can say, well, what comes next, you know, hey, let's work on democratizing our housing system and creating good housing conditions for everybody, then everybody's on board because you've made it very practical. So that's what I would suggest as well.
Yes, thank you very much. It was a provocative comment and question, of course, because I see this challenge, and that's why we work in for example, in our case, in energy transition, because of course you have objectives like long-term objectives, but how to get there, no? And in fact, I think it's the tricky, the really challenge we face now. So I think we have finished. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I hope you have a great rest of the conference.
Yes, we continue with the next presentations, etc. So thank you very much. See you at some point.
Yeah, see you at some point. And I'm sorry I can't go to the coffee break with you, but you know, email and social media do exist. So get in touch. It would be lovely to hear from you.
Yes.